Chris Hipkins.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. I'm happy to take this call on the commencement clause of the Hamilton City Council Parana Park land vesting bill. It's in fact my first call on the bill, but I did want to take a call on the commencement clause, a very specific clause, but I think commencement clauses in legislation are vastly underrated and aren't debated enough. And I think that members fail to understand the significance of a commencement clause and in fact the complexity of the issues behind a commencement clause, because while they may seem simple on the surface, Mr Chair, there's actually a huge amount of complexity involved, and I'm going to talk you through some of that. Because this commencement clause here says this Act comes into force on the day after which it receives the royal assent. Now that may seem very simple in writing, nice clear black and white, but the day after it receives the royal assent, what does that actually mean? The royal assent means effectively in New Zealand the day after which it is signed by the Governor-General. Now actually the Governor-General in New Zealand has some reserve powers. The Governor-General could refuse to sign this bill. So this bill could be passed by Parliament and the Governor-General could say, I don't like it, I'm not going to sign it. The New Zealand Governor-General has that ability on behalf of the Queen, as it is at the moment, has the ability to refuse to assent to a piece of legislation. Now, Tim McIndoe says I'm making a mockery of Parliament by talking about the constitutional significance of the Governor-General signing a piece of legislation. I don't think that's making a mockery of the Parliament at all. Mr Chair, so coming back to the issue of whether or not the Governor-General signs a piece of legislation, it's not actually the House that recommends to the Governor-General whether or not a piece of legislation should be signed. It's the Prime Minister normally, or often the Attorney-General, or it could be any other minister. It's usually a minister of the Crown that makes that recommendation to the Governor-General. It has everything to do with this bill because it will determine when this bill actually becomes the law. So the Parliament could pass this, the Prime Minister could recommend to the Governor-General that it be passed and that it be signed into law. When that happens, of course, could be up to the Prime Minister may do that very swiftly, as they normally do. They may not. Prime Minister may not report that very swiftly to the Governor-General for signature. And of course the Governor-General, as I've said, is under no obligation to sign it. There is a constitutional convention that they will sign all of the legislation presented to them on behalf of the Parliament by the Prime Minister, but they don't need to. And they have a reserve power to refuse to do so. And in fact there are instances in the past where the Governor-General has been petitioned not to sign a piece of legislation. And if they chose to do that, I think there was some legislation in the 1970s regarding the SIS, and the Governor-General at the time, Keith Holyoake, former National Party Prime Minister, had the opportunity, should he have chosen to, not to sign that piece of legislation, and it wouldn't have become the law. He decided not to go with the people who petitioned him, but to go with the then Prime Minister, Sir Robert Muldoon, and he signed that piece of legislation and it became the law. And that was, of course, I think, the constitutionally proper thing for him to do, to sign the legislation, and therefore it became law, because the Parliament ultimately has that supremacy in New Zealand. It's the laws of the land are made by this Parliament, and I think that it's incumbent on our unelected head of state to sign those laws on behalf of the people who are elected. There is a remaining technicality in here, which is that this bill doesn't specify a specific date on which it should come into force. That's actually quite a welcome thing. As a member of the Regulations Review Committee, I'm aware of issues around allowing any flexibility around the dates, for example. This bill's very specific. Governor-General signs it, it becomes the law. It doesn't contain what's called a Henry VIII clause, which gives the government of the day the choice to introduce this law whenever they felt like it. So it doesn't say this bill will come into force on the day that a minister determines or the day that the Hamilton City Council determines. It's very clear. It comes into force on the day after the Governor-General signs it. So the democratic process actually is being respected by the commencement clause as it is worded, providing the Governor-General, of course, does their part and doesn't decide to utilise their reserve powers and refuse to sign the piece of legislation, which under our current constitutional arrangements they could do. So, Mr Chair, as I said, the commencement clause of all legislation, I think, is vastly underrated. I think it's actually a very important part of the parliamentary process, and one that we probably from time to time should spend a little bit of time talking about, so that those who pass the laws actually understand that, and so that those who follow the proceedings of Parliament, and of course there are many of them who follow the proceedings of Parliament home, actually understand what we're doing.
Mr Chair. Tim McIndoe.
I move that the question be now put.
Ian Lee's